Well, wonderful to be here with you, John, and wonderful to introduce you to everyone else. I'm here with John Avlon, who is the author of his latest of many books, um, and we're thrilled to be discussing it. This is a real tour de force about Lincoln and the fight for peace, and it's a historical analysis of Lincoln, his attempt to rebuild the nation after the Civil War until his tragic assassination, but also about how those efforts really carried forth for 100 years really after his assassination and what happened there. So John, as I'm sure everyone who's watching already knows, is a senior political analyst and anchor at CNN. He was editor-in-chief prior to that and managing director at the Daily Beast. He was a columnist at the New York Sun. He was chief speechwriter for the mayor of New York during 9/11. He's published a whole series of books about Washington's farewell, about wingnuts and the need to move away from our radical fringes and back to some centrism and independent nation. And now about the only founding father who wasn't an actual founding father, Lincoln. My daughter collects quarters and is now collecting bills and keeps asking me about who all the people are on all the bills. And I think of Lincoln as kind of our founding father by another mother, as it were. Um, so thrilled to have you here. A lot has been written on Lincoln, and finding any new interesting angle is not particularly easy. And you focus on just a few weeks really at the end of his life, and the humanization is remarkable, especially the scenes with his son as a mother. They really, almost was crying watching him and his son. Can you just share what led you to write this book, and where did this idea even come from?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. I'm a huge admirer of your work and the work of everyone at Carnegie. And, it does seem like a fool's errand to write a book about Abraham Lincoln, given that there are 16,000 of them. I was a little stunned and humbled to figure out. My last book was about Washington and his warning to the nation about the forces he feared that could destroy our democracy. And all my writing and all my books and columns have been in one way or another about how we confront and overcome hyperpartisanship and polarization, and how strong leaders can emerge from the center, and how that represents a deeper American tradition than perhaps is advertised, given the misappropriation of a lot of these folks in our contemporary political debates. And Lincoln is somebody who, he's the forever American. So, you're naturally attracted to him. I have always been. And then there was a sense that, well, what Washington was warning about came to fruition, unfortunately, 80 years later. This was, Lincoln as a young man had said, as a nation of free men, we will live for all time or die by suicide. And this was that moment, that struggle. And at a time when, Americans feel more divided than any time since the Civil War. And there's, I think, dangerous talk about a second Civil War. Lincoln's leadership looms larger than ever, but there was a second layer as well, which I think is the one that leads to its differentiation. It's the question of how you win a peace, and what Lincoln's vision for winning the peace was after Civil War. What was his plan for national reconciliation and reunification? And as I had the germ of the idea for the book, I was focused on two images that had stuck with me. One was the story of Lincoln and the fall of Richmond, walking into the city while the fires were still burning, holding his son Tad's hand on the boy's 12th birthday, which is the opening scene of the book. It seemed to me one of the most dramatic moments in American history, and it gets weirdly short shrift, even in multi-volume Lincoln books. The second was a quote I found from General Lucius Clay, and years ago, who was the general who oversaw the U.S. occupation of Germany. And he was a son of the South, born 30 years after the Civil War. And somebody asked him, what guided your decisions? And he said, I tried to think what Abraham Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived. And that stuck with me. And so it's this distillation of his vision for winning the peace, which he never gets to enact fully because he's assassinated 5 days after Appomattox. And then the afterlife of that idea and how it's implemented. And so it's an unusual tour of Lincoln's life, this intensely close focus on the last 6 weeks of his life. And then the Lincoln path to winning a peace. What happened when we fell off it, and what happened when we were more faithful to it.
So you hint at that aftermath, and I really want to get into that. But just to give listeners a sense of the scope of the book, and you go all the way up through World War II. Can you just walk us through a little bit the sections really and where you go?
Sure, and this is the part that is the left turn that will surprise folks, but it's part of what I think differentiates it. I'm always interested in the afterlife of the idea, how the ideas outlive the individuals, which takes us out of a narrative history that I hope is very tactile and character driven and vivid into what's the impact. How do we bring ideas to life even after the death of the individual who inspired them or developed them? The first 2/3 of the book is this last 6 weeks of his life. The second inaugural, which is his sort of Sermon on the Mount, through his last speech, which everyone's expecting a triumphal address the night the Civil War effectively ends, or he announced it in Washington, but instead he gives a practical speech, almost lawyerly, about his vision of what should guide Reconstruction. But then I trace this afterlife. I trace how Andrew Johnson disastrously got us off the Lincoln path. A person with the opposite character and temperament of Abraham Lincoln, who tried to resist the progress towards equal rights towards blacks and simultaneously re-empowered the reemergence of the Confederate leaders. It's sort of an example of what not to do. How briefly we got back on the right path under President Grant, who had heard directly from Lincoln's vision for how you win a peace, the liberal and honorable terms he wanted to extend to the rank and file. In particularly, I think, encapsulated by the passage of the 1871 Anti-KKK Enforcement Act, which has been reinvoked recently for the first time in a long time, and how it was implemented by a Southern Attorney General, Amos T. Ackerman, which I think was inspired at an important moment. Extending to the international sphere, how Woodrow Wilson is impacted by his childhood in the Civil War and in Reconstruction, and that humiliation, and the way that those scars stayed with him and influenced his idea of a peace among equals, a peace without victory. But then how he crucially gets it wrong, because one of Lincoln's key precepts is no ceasefire before surrender. And that's precisely what Wilson doesn't do. And then they're punishing reparations that get implemented, which set the stage, obviously, for the Second World War. And then finally, how the Second World War generation, the grandchildren of the Civil War, get it right. They get it right in terms of Lincoln's essential prescription, unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace. FDR and Churchill back a policy of unconditional surrender. FDR actually explains it as being what Lincoln wanted to do after the Civil War and what was enacted at Appomattox. And then that really follow through of a magnanimous peace by building our opposing nations back up, particularly Germany and Japan, but then also the Marshall Plan, where Truman, who himself was the descendant of Confederate sympathizers, and Marshall worked with Republican Arthur Vandenberg to get a bipartisan support for this massive investment in peace. And that was in some ways the apotheosis of American influence, the good America, but it followed through, I think, quite directly in terms of implementing Lincoln's vision for a just and a lasting peace on a global scale.
It's really interesting to me how in your explication here, you really draw out how the ideas matter, but the implementation matters too. Yeah. And that you can get the ideas just right, and the implementation you can really mess up the way Woodrow Wilson did. And you can also get the implementation right, even if the ideas are a little sketchier, which is the case in your Japan chapter, I think. And so it's really interesting how important those two are together. Here at Carnegie, my colleagues and I have been deeply engaged, as you know, in overcoming today's polarization and the increasing political violence in our country. It's actually why I wanted to host you here for many reasons, but the parallels between the time you're writing about and our own time are a little too close for comfort. And I want you to take us back emotionally to those weeks the war was ending, that immense loss of life, that incredible cost everyone had just borne, this national mobilization for war. Talk about the lines that were drawn at the time between the peace Democrats and the radical Republicans. How was Lincoln trying to knit together this deeply divided nation, given the emotions at the time? It's very easy to talk about these things kind of cut and dry and cold, as if we're moving chess pieces. But their situation, not too unlike the Ukraine war right now, they were in the middle of a war. And so how is Lincoln walking between these different groups politically, and what is he trying to do?
It's a great and perhaps the important question, and I have read your work on combating polarization and defending democracy, and those of your colleagues. I've discussed it on CNN, and it's one of many things that I value about what Carnegie does. Lincoln is a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries, and so he is buffeted about and attacked often from both sides of this debate. Remember, Lincoln is leading an upstart third party. The Republican Party at the time is a big tent party. It's moderate. It's a moderate progressive party in contemporary concepts that contains abolitionists to people who want to stop the spread of slavery. The radical Republicans had become the most powerful bloc in Congress, and these are people who have a very vengeful idea of victory. They want to rip the South out by its roots. There are also these peace Democrats that want peace at almost any cost, and they are what we identify now as the peace protesters who take to the streets. They call Lincoln a butcher and a tyrant and a monster for perpetuating the war, they believe. But Lincoln's point is that he wants peace, but he will not accept a peace that would simply sow the seeds for the next war. The peace at any price is too expensive, especially when you consider that those peace activists at the time, predominantly Democrats, are willing to accept the permanent partition of the Union or the perpetuation of slavery. And Lincoln's point is that we need to make the suffering mean something, that we have to redeem something. We have to remove the root cause of the war, finally, which is, of course, slavery. And so he is walking this line. And there's a great line from Frederick Douglass, which I think sums up Lincoln's particular positioning, where he says, look, from a genuine abolitionist perspective, Frederick Douglass says, Lincoln could seem tardy, cool, and indifferent to the goal of ending slavery. Seen from the position of politicians and the American people, a sentiment as a statesman he's bound to consult, Lincoln was zealous, determined, and radical. And I think the secret there is that what Lincoln is focused on is how we can make sustainable progress. He's incredibly conscious of the dangers of overreach and backlash and moving too far too fast. It's typified in some ways by his approach to the border states during the Civil War, which is largely forgotten about. Basically, there are 5 states that are slaveholding that don't join the Confederacy. And Lincoln works with them to end slavery within their legislatures. But he doesn't push the Emancipation Proclamation right away, in part because he's concerned that he will force those states into the Confederacy, which will change the balance of power. And you're right. I spent a lot of time talking about not just the politics, but the policy and the implementation. And I do that also in terms of the post-war. And that's because the ideas are interesting, but it's their implementation that matters. And the goal in all of this is applied history. It's useful wisdom. It's learning from the past so we can apply it to the present. And viewing these ideas abstractly does no one any good. And I think makes a less interesting story because Lincoln, to a large extent, had no precedent to draw on. There's no Civil War this scale. And so that's part of what makes his leadership so extraordinary.
Yeah, I must say, reading this and even watching the movie Lincoln that came out with I think Daniel Day-Lewis a number of years ago, when I saw the movie, I thought, gosh, he's such a politician. I was sort of disappointed. And then I thought, no, actually makes it a much greater feat that he was a politician. He didn't have the role of an abolitionist, or those are easier roles to play in a certain way than the role he was given at the time. So one of the other points that you really drive home in the book is this emphasis on accountability for the leadership of the rebellion, of the Civil War, with lenience for the rank and file. And it was a really huge innovation. As you say, he had nothing to draw on. There were the Greek wars. He read quite a lot about the ancient Greek wars, Thucydides and so on. But then he had the monarchical wars in between, which didn't really have, this sort of interest in caring about the serfs and so on. So he was really interested in this kind of negotiation with the elites, but also how to make sure that the society had different flavor. He also mentioned a number of times that he hoped some Confederates would just escape, would just get away. Right now we're a country that's talking about how to prosecute our last president for some clear law breaking. in tax law and business issues and so on. This kind of parsing of the question strikes me as really particularly interesting from an implementation point of view. How do you deal with the leaders of a rebellion? And then how do you deal with all their followers? So can you talk about these different levels at which he was trying to address this problem?
Thank you for that, because it's such an important question. And it does speak to a degree of flexibility. But, one of the things that's so characteristic of Lincoln is that he is going to be inflexible on achieving great goals, but enormously flexible on the details. And what you're describing here is that he wants to hold the Confederate leadership to account. That does not mean the letter of the law, which for treason is execution. But he wants to be enormously merciful to the rank and file because he considers them misled. And this goes back to presidential proclamations dealing with amnesty that go back to 1863 and 1864, and where he makes it very clear that the rank and file should be given liberal and honorable terms. As he tells General Grant on the River Queen, they should be able to take their crows to shoot, take their guns to home to shoot crows with, and their horses to plow with. He just wants them to accept the laws of the Union again and become fellow citizens again. But for the leadership who ought to have known better, particularly for members of the U.S. Congress who left to join the Confederacy, judges who left the bench to join the Confederacy, generals who left the military, of which there were a massive number of officers who left to join the Confederacy, and members of the Confederate cabinet and Congress. Those people, he did not want to be able to claw their way back to power. He didn't want the planter class to be restored. And indeed, one of the debates at the time was Reconstruction versus Restoration. Lincoln did not want to restore those people to power. He did not want to offer them amnesty. And the distinction there was he didn't want them to be able to benefit from the rebellion against the Constitution in the country that they had perpetuated. But he didn't want to execute them either. That's the key point. He wanted Jefferson Davis to just run away. In the last cabinet meeting, he puts his hand on the desk and he goes like, "Let's just shoo away," like he's shooing sheep. He tells another great story about how there's a guy who's quit drinking, and he goes in on a very hot day to a friend's bar, and he says, "I'd love a lemonade." And the friend says, "Do you want me to put some whiskey in it?" And he said, "Well, maybe a little bit wouldn't hurt as long as it's unbeknownst to me." And the joke there is, if Jefferson Davis were to escape the Union unbeknownst to Lincoln, he would be just fine with it. He spoke in parables and stories and jokes. But that was to deprive the South of a martyr. He didn't want to have to execute Jefferson Davis. But that would be a logical conclusion if you were applying the laws to a former senator who leads a rebellion. So you see this balance of strength and magnanimity, which is so characteristic of Lincoln. He is somebody who, as a matter of his personality, he is a man of peace who ends up leading a nation through war. He has no military experience, no executive experience. He is really an empathetic human. One of the things I find so endearing about him is that he shows us that kindness can be consistent with effective leadership. And he really speaks consistently about using empathy as a mean to reasoning with your opponent. So he wants to be merciful, but he knows he needs to do it from a position of strength. And you have to draw a distinction between leaders and the rank and file. So as it applies to today, first of all, I think we can say, as we have learned, that their truth needs to precede reconciliation. And I would argue that accountability needs to precede reconciliation, particularly for people who try to lead an insurrection and overturn an election. For the people who plotted to overturn an election, you cannot simply say, we'll let bygones to be bygones, because then you're effectively seeding the next insurrection. I mean, you are basically saying, you're legitimizing it and until the next time. So there needs to be accountability. There needs to be truth. And then there can be reconciliation. But for the rank and file, there should be mercy. And for the people who perpetuated at the highest levels, there should be accountability. We're not talking about executions here, but should there be legal accountability? You're damn right.
So I think it's a beautiful explanation for what he was trying to do, and a very nuanced one that I feel is hard to do in modern day, to draw these distinctions, and yet not impossible,
No.
to draw these lines. I think the other thing he did so beautifully was that he recognized he had to deal with these radical elites who were fueling insurrection, and that was a policy problem. But he also had to deal with Southern society, which was broken, absolutely destroyed. In my own book, now I can't remember the number, but Mississippi spent, I don't remember, a third of its GDP, something gigantic, on prosthetic limbs
Yeah.
that first year out. So this broken society, this disillusioned society, it's disillusioned with its own elites that had led us into this devastating war. It's angry at the North. It largely still holds the same views on slavery that it did before. So policy is a really blunt instrument to deal with those social feelings. You can be magnanimous, but that doesn't necessarily alter hearts and minds. And I'm interested in what Lincoln thought he could do, what government could do about jumpstarting that societal level healing.
Yeah, this is the subtly wonky side of my book, which I love, but is not for everybody or every reader. And it's not an obstacle, but it's there if that's what you care about. First of all, Lincoln, I think accurately and importantly, thinks about reconciliation and reunification on a policy level. In terms of, first, you've got to secure the military gains that are in place. You need to establish the rule of law. You need political reform to remove the root cause of a lot of these conflicts, which is, in part, adoption of state constitutions that have abolished slavery. You need to have economic investment and economic expansion. And here's where actions he takes in 1862, in the darkest days of the war, are so important. And when you take a step back, you can really see how it plays out. Things like the Transcontinental Railroad, land grant colleges, the Homestead Act. Why is he doing that? When he talks to people who come by his office, he says, look, I want people to move west and mine, and America has natural resources that will help us pay down the debt. In part, what he wants to do is depolarize the tension between North and South by moving the nation's attention west. He welcomes an enormous number of new immigrants into the country. He doesn't see that he's not concerned that the labor pool will be overwhelmed. He wants to welcome new immigrants in, and he hopes that basically an economic expansion will create a shared investment in a prosperous future. And so he actually sets up legislative structures that will help create that long after he's gone. And by the way, it works. The trickiest thing, as you say, is cultural reintegration, which is the third bit, because secession, slavery has isolated the South. The pain is enormous. Partly what he realizes, his role as president, in word and deed, he can set an example and steer the nation towards a horizon of reconciliation, knowing that it will take time. It'll take time, particularly to create a multiracial democracy. But he hopes that whites and blacks, as he says, will be able to live their way into a new arrangement with each other, as long as the basic laws are in place and enforced. He thinks time and economy will do a lot, but that's why you see in one of my favorite stories in the book, he's touring when he goes to the front lines for 2 weeks towards the end of the war. And his last day, he tours the Depot Field Hospital, which is massive. And there are all these wounded Union soldiers. And he goes in and he shakes their hand and he talks to them. And he is very emotional and tears up when he views the devastation. And he's just completed his rounds and he sees a tent in the back. And he asks the doctor who's touring him, he said, "What's that over there?" And the doctor is kind of an imperious guy and says, "Well, you don't need to worry about that. Those are just wounded rebels." And he said, "That's exactly where I do need to go." And he goes and he introduces himself to each of the wounded Confederate veterans. And you see the enormous transformative effect that example has, that personal example, where they're staring into his eyes and seeing his emotion. And some of them start breaking down, crying, because they realize they've been fighting for a lie. They've been fed this line about Lincoln being a butcher and a tyrant and King Africanus the First. And they realize that he is a kind man who looks on them eye to eye. And that itself, decades later, they remember that interaction. And you can see the thawing. And there are also practical things like the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, which Lincoln helps create, which is an enormously important organization, which is basically like an early NGO under the Defense Department auspices to transition people towards self-sufficiency from slavery. and to give land to folks. But Andrew Johnson, that's one of the first things he does is he kills it. And that has massive repercussions. So it's a combination of presidential leadership, personal, rhetorical, but then also policy driven, long-term policies that create a structure that within which reconciliation can occur over time.
So you just brought up about 15 new questions I want to ask you, and I'm about to go ahead and ask you, but I also want to invite our audience members. I will get to your questions if you have questions too, so please do send them on. We'll put them in the chat and bring them in here, but let me try to fit in as many of my 15 as I can here. So, one of the things that your move west makes me think about is this actually directly connects with how we think about transforming polarized societies today. There's a whole body of work my colleague Jennifer McCoy does on anti-polarization, and my colleague Tom Carruthers. And one of the things you look for is how to transform these conflicts. You really can't resolve them. Some of these are like old marriages where you have, fight number 43, and it's fight number 43, and you're not going to actually resolve it. But you can move it into a different realm. And so that's what Lincoln was trying to do with this. Okay, let's not have the North-South debate. Let's think about expansion west with all of its problems that we recognize now, but what he was trying to do. And this is what Canada did. Canada in years past was having a secessionist movement in Quebec, and it was a very significant secessionist movement. And the big fight was between the French and the Anglos and who was going to really run the soul of Canada. And they transformed their immigration policy from this white Canada policy, it was explicitly a white Canada policy, to a kind of multicultural skills-based one. We'll let you in if you have the skills, and we don't care as much where you come from. And the effect that it had was to take this binary and turn it into it's a whole new world. So now we've got the Indigenous peoples of Canada. We also have a huge Indian Canadian population, Chinese Canadian, and so on. So suddenly the binary was broken. And you see this in conflict after conflict that managed to get out of the conflict, this transformation. And it makes me wonder today, I'm going to put a pin in this for you to think about later, what our transformative moment is now, how we transform the cultural wars now and so on that we're in to just something very different. But what I wanted to ask you particularly is these transformative visions and so on. These are visions that Lincoln was trying to push from the high policy level, from his role as head of a federal government. But he also really thought that there was a role for personal one-on-one contact, that look in the eyes that you said. And he obviously could not look millions and millions of Americans in the eyes. So he was thinking a lot about the role of local communities and what local communities could do. Could you talk a little bit about how he saw local communities' role in peace building and in sort of healing this nation after this conflict?
He really did think, despite the fact he's president who was accused of being a tyrant of a strong central government and all those, the old echoes that we hear all the time in our politics, one of which is strong central government versus, agrarian decentralization. He actually thinks a lot about local communities. He's from small towns, and Illinois was the West. And he's born in the South and he moves north, and there's constantly this aspect of Lincoln where he combines opposites and he's able to transcend them. But even in his last speech, his view of Reconstruction is surprisingly federalist. He has an enormous amount of faith in the idea or the belief that individual localities, communities, and states need to buy into Reconstruction, that it can't be a one size fits all, that yes, you have a couple of non-negotiable goals that states have to buy into, just as he was insisting to the Confederacy, assumption of the federal, acceptance of federal union, end of slavery, no ceasefire before surrender. In the case of Reconstruction, it's that we are going to end slavery. Your state constitution needs to pass that. You need to accept the federal union. And there will be different paths at different speeds towards moving toward a multiracial democracy. And he understands, though, it has to, the tone and temper and pace needs to fit the individual states for it to stick. People need to feel invested in it. And I think that's one of the surprising things about Lincoln's vision, but that shows that he is very deft. And these aren't contradictions, and they're not in like overwhelming abstractions. He's trying to meet people where they live, literally, knowing that these things will take time. And unlike the radical Republicans, does not believe that you can impose on the top down without a kickback. And that's precisely what he's trying to avoid. The genius, the reason I call him a sort of a soulful centrist, isn't just his stylistic reaching out, with empathy and using humor and logic and scripture to reach out to try to depolarize divides, but it's because he's really focused on how to achieve sustainable change. And that does require a degree of gradualism. But I argue his gradualism has a grandeur in it because he's thinking about getting maximum buy-in. And he doesn't have this sort of utopian vision where everything needs to be done from the top down. And I think that's one of the things that gives him real wisdom.
Yeah. It's humbling, I think, to look back. I want to get into character a little bit now, because I think when it's easy, especially maybe for those of us in think tanks, to think that the best presidents are the ones with the highest degrees. But when you actually look at our best presidents, they're often the ones with the most character and the most just empathetic ability to understand where their people are, how they can lead them, how far they can lead them, where they can lead them to. And Lincoln is just clearly a master, as you said, this empathetic, soulful leader. His vice president was not. And if there's ever an argument for the need to sometimes change American institutions, it is the way that we elected presidents and vice presidents back then, which led Lincoln to have Andrew Johnson. It is that he would never have picked Andrew Johnson, I think, in a modern method of presidential and vice presidential picking. Maybe he would. I take that back. But the institutions of how these roles got divvied up meant that there was a lot of reason to assassinate Lincoln, because if you assassinated Lincoln, you were going to get Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was a very different character. He was vengeful and personalistic and petty. He was also a drunk, or at least a drunk on the day of the inauguration. And if you're drunk on that day, you probably are drinking other days too. And as you mentioned, he destroys the Freedmen's Bureau. He immediately lets the elites, a number of the Confederate elites, vote again, and sort of overturns Lincoln's whole plan. So I want to have you talk a little bit about sorry, I'm going to frame this wrong, how Andrew Johnson really killed so many of Lincoln's plans, and what some of the big mistakes from that era are that we're living with today that had to do with how Andrew Johnson transformed Lincoln's vision.
So many. And that is almost a big question as you can get, but let me distill it. First of all, let me absolutely, with my whole heart, agree with you that the study of history, American history, makes it very clear that character is the indispensable core quality of a great presidency. It's not formal education. Indeed, if you look at people who are generally considered our greatest presidents, or in the top, 5 or 10, Washington and Lincoln have no formal education to speak of. They're self-taught. Lincoln is incredibly smart, and his self-taught legal training infuses everything he does. Harry Truman has no formal education. And yet, look at what he was able to achieve. So it is about character. It's about curiosity. It's about empathy. Those are not the things that Andrew Johnson has. And it's important to remember that, Lincoln is considered our greatest president, but he's bookended by two of men who are considered our worst, or two of our worst, Buchanan and Johnson, who themselves are very different. I call Johnson the anti-Lincoln. And he, if you look at descriptions of his personality at the time, and particularly the Atlantic Monthly at one point describes him in this really resonant series of sentences, egotistic to the point of mental disease, sullen and stubborn and thin-skinned and vengeful. It sounds not a little like our recent president. And what the downstream effect, this was Lincoln's decision, and it was the worst decision of his presidency, and it has the greatest impact because he is not, we've never had a president who's been assassinated. And even though Lincoln's getting threats all the time and he's sort of fatalistic about it, Johnson is there, and he is actually ironically known as the Avenger, like the radical, he's a war Democrat. He's the only Democratic senator not to secede. The radical Republicans think he's going to be better for them for Reconstruction. They are In fact, Benjamin Wade, even before Lincoln's assassinated, openly hopes that Lincoln will be assassinated because he wants Johnson to lead a more vengeful reconstruction. He thinks he's going to get from Lincoln. But it turns out that Johnson has duped all those folks because he's not a race warrior. He's a class warrior. He is actually not radical. He's deeply reactionary. He's incredibly bigoted. He basically almost immediately starts getting Lincoln's equation completely wrong. He resists and attacks anything that smacks of moving African Americans towards equal rights. He bitterly opposes vetoes the Civil Rights Act, dismantles the Freedmen's Bureau, and starts giving pardons and amnesty to any Confederate plantation owner who applies for one. He enjoys being in that position because he had been a poor white farmer in the South at one point. He enjoyed the flattery and the supplication. He kicks black Union troops who deserve the lion's share of credit for turning the tide of the war out of the South. He empowers or approves of Confederate generals taking over states, an explicit contravention of Lincoln's wishes, who in turn passed black codes as soon as the late summer and fall of 1865. And this is slavery without the chains. He's okay with all of it. And he comes up with his own rationalization, but you see a strong current of bigotry flowing through all of it. And it gets us off the Lincoln path, and we don't fully recover. I mean, Andrew Grant does a good job of trying to put us back on the Lincoln path. And then the election of 1876 on the back of a depression really seals the deal. And you see, in terms of lessons for today, I mean, my God, if you ever want evidence that progress is not, perpetual, and the dangers of voter suppression and voter intimidation, violent voter intimidation and election subversion, just look at the South in that brief window. And so we see all the dangers of misleadership and the fact that there's a narrow window maybe within which a different path could have been chosen. The South might have accepted defeat. But Johnson gets the ratio perfectly wrong. Then the radicals come in and bring troops back to the South, which increases resentment. The KKK emerges in the vacuum that Lincoln had feared. The brief instance of black elected officials is rolled back and basically erased from history through violence and legal decisions with ex-Confederates on the bench. And the whole thing is a tragedy that replaces slavery with segregation for a century. You cannot overestimate the downstream effect of that disastrous but brief presidency.
It's sobering, especially when you think about just how similar he is to a president today from a character standpoint. As you said, I sit on the task force on election crises, the national task force that tries to moderate these things. And actually, it's one of the things that we've been supportive of is reform to the Election Count Act, because the Election Count Act was passed at this time, 1876 era, when it was violence that allowed our election to be swayed. All the violence you're talking about in voter suppression, and we're seeing such similarities between that era of history and today. And as you say, I don't think people of my age group, at least, were taught, we would always go to the Civil War and then somehow we jump to World War II in our history books and kind of veer back and forth, which is exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to jump to World War II next, but I want to get to one of our audience questions because, we've investigated the heart of darkness here and Andrew Johnson, but one of our audience members wants to know about Frederick Douglass. You could think of this as the good angel and the bad angel, or the bad devil on the shoulders. What influence did Frederick Douglass have on Lincoln's views of reconciliation? How did he think about Frederick Douglass's own views, which were quite strong and nuanced and interesting, with these thoughts of his own?
Look, I think that Douglass and Lincoln and Grant are sort of the leaders of the second founding, and Douglass. I mean, the David Blight biography, which won the Pulitzer a few years ago, is excellent. I can't recommend it highly enough. And he will continue to ascend. His relationship with Lincoln itself is fascinating. They are at times, Douglass sees very clearly his role as an abolitionist is to prod and push Lincoln. But he does so with a sense of appreciation for Lincoln's responsibilities, which not all radicals do. Again, I bring into that quote, from a genuine abolitionist perspective, Lincoln can be seen as tardy, cool, and Dahl, from a political standpoint, he's zealous, determined, and radical. So he gets it. In the second inaugural in particular, Douglas is sitting up front. What's extraordinary about the second inaugural, which I go into great depths into as a text, both the delivery of it that day and then the last paragraph in particular, which is the perfect summation of the vision of the fight for peace. It's the summation of Lincoln's vision for reconciliation. It is a 701 word speech. The vast majority, 4/5, is very Old Testament. It is a vengeful God seeking punishment upon the whole nation for the original sin of slavery. There's no moral equivalence between the North and the South, but he doesn't do the us against them, even though it's the easiest thing for a president to do in a civil war that he knows he's about to win. But he's not going to let the North feel moral superiority because they were complicit in the perpetuation of slavery, even just because they were buying cotton and rice and allowed it to occur. And when he gets into some of the most sort of Old Testament paragraphs about this war will continue as long as God is seeking repayment in effect for 250 years of the lash will be repaid by the sword. The first integrated second inaugural in American history. Black soldiers and their families, and Douglas is there, and you start to see the black citizens in the audience, or black soldiers in the audience, are saying, "Bless the Lord." They're doing call and response to that most difficult and challenging of paragraphs, which Douglas really notices and appreciates that in particular. We all remember the New Testament turn at the end to sort of, this life after death, and is a beautiful, perfect sentence and paragraph. It's deep. But so Douglas then goes to the White House, and initially he can't get in. He's refused entry. And word gets to Lincoln, he brings him in, and Lincoln makes a great show of, "Here comes my friend Douglas," sort of elevating him. And he says, "You're the person whose opinion I want to know the most about what you thought about that speech." And Douglas says it was a sacred effort. He talks about how it's the window of the wisdom of the Hebrew prophets were imbued in that speech. And you see that Douglas, that over time, his estimation of Lincoln only grows, and it's not just by comparison to Johnson, although that's easy. He speaks at the dedication of Emancipation Memorial that's still in Washington, which is paid for with the money of freed slaves. And that speech itself is an extraordinary summation of Lincoln and his political position in urging on the end of slavery for all time, but the pace and politics with which Lincoln used to do it. And then I think the other thing about Douglas that deserves even more appreciation than it typically gets is a speech he gives later on called America's the Composite Nation. And it's a real vision of a multiracial democracy that's open to people of similar spirit from around the world, that makes us stronger, not weaker. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the debates we are having are about reckoning with the idea, which we have been fitfully evolving to, but toward a multiracial democracy and a majoritarian democracy. And there have been forces in our country that have resisted both those things forever. And those are the tribal lines we're breaking down on. But it's a fascinating friendship, and he features very prominently in the book.
Yeah. So I wanted you bring up this idea of Douglas, Lincoln, and Grant as this kind of second founding. I want to just touch on Grant before I promised World War II. We'll get to World War II. But I think everybody who's listening is getting a sense of the book from how you're talking. It's just this incredibly rich book. It's like a history rather than a policy book that we write. It's got that kind of depth that history has and that texture. And you get into Grant and how he, even in the face of Johnson's leadership, is trying to enforce Lincoln's wishes and trying to use the tools left at his disposal to do what he can to bring the South in line through the rule of law. Can you talk a little bit about Grant's role, both at the moment of peace, because he is the guy who heard Lincoln's ideas, and then afterward, how he tries to use these tools he's got?
Sure. So Grant, his nickname is Unconditional Surrender Grant. And Lincoln really, after expressing a lot of frustration with the 5 commanding generals before him, finds his man. Grant is very aggressive. And that's one of the things Lincoln likes about it. But when they spend these, days together, weeks together, at any point, they spend a lot of time together. And Lincoln is constantly sort of saying that here's the terms of peace I want you to offer. It's a very detailed vision. So when Grant finally presides over the surrender of Lee at Appomattox, and I get into the final sort of thrust and parry of those late days. When Grant sits down to write the terms, he's basically taking mental dictation from everything Lincoln has told him on a porch at Petersburg for an hour and a half the day before, on the River Queen with Sherman and Admiral Porter, which is a portrait that Truman bought in 1947 that hangs prominently in the White House today, which is an inspired portrait called The Peacemakers. And so Grant is basically taking dictation, and he keeps Lincoln's vision in mind consistently. After Lincoln's death, when he is in charge of the war, he's trying to keep the nonpartisan nature of the military alive with Andrew Johnson, but not allow him to completely subvert Reconstruction at the same time. He runs for president in 1868 under the term "Let us have peace." And he is very much, he hires a Southern Attorney General to implement the anti-KKK acts of 1871. And I will say, just parenthetically there, the work you do, the Civil War generation left us a lot of tools to deal with insurrectionists with an idea that they would not only apply to the past rebellion, the War of the Rebellion, but to future as well. And we're rediscovering some of them, including especially the 1871 Anti-KKK Act, the Electoral Count Act, which needs to be reformed, and the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which would bar insurrectionists from holding federal office, which should be applied or examined intensely. At any rate, Grant really does get us back on Lincoln's path. The KKK has three major incarnations in American history. It's the 1860s, 70s, led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate general. Then Grant, basically working with Amos T. Ackerman, kills them. I mean, it's very instructive in terms of how you beat back extremist groups. The section in my book's called USA versus KKK, but he has the license to bring in federal troops. He has a Southern Attorney General who can prosecute without being called a carpetbagger, and they focus again on the leadership. They send the KKK leadership to like 800 of them up to Albany, prison in Albany, and the violence does recede. That's not perfect. There's enormous violence and lynching done in the South, but the KKK in particular is dismantled and doesn't reemerge until the 1920s. The sobering thing about Grant, if that is the proper term, first of all, there is a depression that kicks in 1873 that saps the nation's determination when it comes to racial reconciliation during Reconstruction. People turn inward. The South, there are allegations of corruption in Grant's administration. And as we know, corruption tends to reduce faith for any organization that claims to represent reform. A new group called the Redeemers come in that actually want to cut taxes and cut spending in the South, reassert white supremacy. They actually want to cut funding for organizations that are integrated, public hospitals, public universities. In 1875, Grant gives an important speech, and the South makes enormous gains, and Confederates start winning re-election to Congress. Grant gives a speech, though, that I think about all the time, and it's a quote I had to check 3 times to make sure it was real, because it seems like it's apocryphal, but it's not. It's 1875, 10 years after Appomattox. He's speaking in Des Moines, Iowa. And he says, if we are to have a second Civil War in the United States, I predict the dividing lines will not be Mason and Dixon's, North versus South. They will be between patriotism and intelligence on the one hand, and superstition, ambition, and ignorance on the other. That's Grant.
Well, thank you. So our 3 refounding fathers, and a lot of wisdom. And, I think for some of our reader or listeners, you might be going into this history thinking, why are we recounting all this history? Some of us like history, but it's also because it's so present. I mean, you take this insight of Grant's and you can apply it to 2022, to 2024, certainly to 2020. These things are so timeless because human nature is so timeless. Now, we've been focused on the U.S. historically, but given the war in Ukraine, I want to widen the aperture and move us up to World War II. So first, can you talk a little bit about what the lines of debate were and how Lincoln's lessons got applied during World War II in Europe and Japan? I think it's really easy for us to look back and say, oh, the Marshall Plan was great. Oh, of course we did the right thing in World War II. But it's very hard to think at the moment, and maybe it's easier right now with Russia invading Ukraine, to remember what would it be like to immediately turn around a week from now and say, okay, we're going to pour aid into Russia? It's not a perfect analogy, but it's not a totally imperfect analogy. These are hard things to think about doing, to take the aggressor and turn them into an ally. And that's really what we did in those two countries. And we didn't just have to do it from a presidential standpoint. The whole country had to get behind it. It was a total country commitment. So can you talk a little bit about what it looks like to turn around to these countries and say, we're going to rebuild your societies, we're going to offer you real dignity, and how that move happened in World War II, how those folks thought about it?
So it couldn't be a more important point, especially given the purpose and the mission of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's in reaction to the failures after the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles, the war to, that was, going to be defend democracy for all time, didn't work out that way for a number of different reasons, most of which I think were harsh terms without the will or the means to implement them, and punishing reparations that give birth to a new lost cause mythology in Germany, I would argue. Got to watch out for these lost cause mythologies. So even during the Second World War and after Pearl Harbor, indeed, FDR gives a speech saying, we will win the peace this time, now that we've finally been dragged into the war. And indeed, there are people at Treasury and State and Defense who are sent to try to figure out how to win the peace. A school I talk about is set up, it actually gets replicated over a number of universities, to talk about military governance. It's something that we hadn't actually done before. And actually, there were a lot of mixed emotions about it, but because there was concern about overreach of the military. But that was critical. So they were proactively thinking about how you win a peace really for the first time in a constructive, structural, institutional, policy-driven way about implementing those ideas. And those ideas do get implemented as a practical basis. And by the way, there's an enormous amount of debate about, I won't get into the Morgenthau plan, but I mean, there's a lot of debate about the right way to do this. And there are the radical Republicans of the era who want to basically make Germany, a 17th century or agrarian nation. But the more magnanimous approach to rebuilding your enemies takes hold. Germany and Japan have different approaches and structures. In particular, MacArthur keeps the emperor in place because he understands the cultural difference. Here's where you get to questions of culture and how you have to fit policies and plans to a local culture. You can't just do them all one size fits all top down. But I think the most instructive to your question is the Marshall Plan. You got to remember that one of the reasons that Wilson, in addition to probably having, Spanish flu, ended up signing off on punishing reparations at the behest of George Clemenceau and David Lloyd George. By the way, Clemenceau had been a journalist who covered Reconstruction as a young man, which is fascinating. And Lloyd George had a portrait of Lincoln over his fireplace in Wales as a child. So you get this continuity, which is fascinating. One of the failures is he gives all that away to get the League of Nations, but he's in an imperious stage and he doesn't bring any Republicans over with him in his peace delegation. He doesn't get buy-in. He's fighting with Henry Cabot Lodge, and they could have had compromise over a couple of key articles. He refuses it. So they're punishing reparations. There's a neo-isolationist movement, and there's no League of Nations. Truman and Marshall, now Secretary of State, try to decide they're going to learn again from the past here too. And they get the idea of investing in peace in the Marshall Plan. They learn from that example. They begin ground up building the idea with Arthur Vandenberg, the Republican Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair. At that particular moment, by the way, it's this one blip where Republicans actually control Congress, by and large. So Truman is not popular. And indeed, people say, oh, name this after yourself, Truman. And Truman says, now, if you name this plane after me, it'll quiver a couple times and die up on Capitol Hill. We'll name it after George Marshall. He's still really popular on Capitol Hill. So they name it the Marshall Plan, and they begin really getting buy-in from day one and building this with Vandenberg, the Republican. He then he fights with the isolationist wing on his far right of the party, which was had been dominant before Pearl Harbor, but still lots of slings and arrows. They brought in former President Herbert Hoover to do missionary work for world famine relief and to help sell it. They got celebrities. They did a blue ribbon panel of CEOs and celebrities to debate and shape and sell the idea. Crucially, they had it said, this is going to be a constrained period of time, 3 to 4 years. It's going to be a lot of money. Remember, this is a country that desperately wants a peace dividend, and they're basically selling them medicine, right? It's not popular per se. And they get a Republican CEO of a Studebaker Corporation to run it. So these are the concessions to Vandenberg. This is not going to be an open-ended New Deal plan. It's going to be run like a business, but it's going to be overwhelmingly generous, and we're going to help rebuild Germany as well as our allied nations. And that makes all the difference. It's a huge lift. It still gets done in just around a year's time, but it's how they went about it. And there was buy-in from Republicans early on, and there were concessions. But it worked. It worked. That's what we're dealing with now in Ukraine. I think one of the things that the NATO Secretary General said the other day, there's another example of an organization which was set up in the wake of the Second World War. We can take peace for granted. And the fact there's been, 70 years of relative peace and prosperity in Europe is unheard of in the history of the continent. And it's a direct result of the structures that were put in place, as a result of all those hard-won lessons. So that's what we can't take for granted. That's the fight for peace. If you don't win the peace, you don't really win the war. That's what Lincoln understood. And that's what we finally did on the continent after the Second World War. And that's why those institutions need to be defended. And, a just and a lasting peace, a just war requires a just peace, yes, but, sometimes you need to fight for peace. Simply saying, well, we need peace at all costs. That's not actually securing peace at all.
Yeah, I think one of the insights you bring out so often is how Lincoln, who's such an empathetic man, says unconditional surrender. They have to know they lost before you can offer them magnanimity. If they don't know they've lost, then you're really not offering magnanimity. So I'm being told that we have 3 minutes. We have an audience question I want to pull in here, but it's also quite similar to what I wanted to ask you, which is, with all of this thinking about how you bring peace after polarization, and given our current set of slightly more reactive and perhaps less visionary leaders, although I suppose every age probably thinks that about their leaders. Yeah. What are your prescriptions for America right now? What do we do, or what lessons can we take from Lincoln's visions now for how to bring greater peace, or do we need to fall into further depths? Do we need that unconditional surrender first?
I desperately hope we don't need to fall to greater depths. I mean, the mere fact that an insurrection attack on our capital on the basis of a lie was not enough to unite us across partisan lines is to me one of the most troubling and sobering aspects of our era. Leadership does matter. Magnanimity does matter. Empathy does matter, reaching out. But let's face it, empathy has been strained right now. I mean, you have a significant portion of one political party that believes a self-evident lie. And what it really is part of this long resistance to multiracial democracy and majoritarian democracy. So I would say that while the politics of the golden rule does apply, while we need to try to have more empathy on an individual level, and the study of any cults or extremist groups and how people get out of it, empathy is a necessary ingredient. It's not scalable, but you have to offer people a faith-saving off-ramp where they don't feel judged, but they're reminded of their real virtues. The second thing is structural. And here's where where I can get policy wonky, but I try to tell the story through history so it tastes a little bit less like medicine. Incentive structures matter. Policies matter. And I do think our incentive structures and our politics is all screwed up. We're not nearly as divided as it feels as a nation. But when 30% of the nation believes that an election is illegitimate, that's still a supermajority of one political party. And I think it speaks to how distended our politics have gotten from actual majoritarian rule. We need, in my mind, redistricting reform, open primaries, ranked choice voting. There are other ideas that some of your colleagues have put forward that have worked in other countries. Multi-member districts is one. We need to make politics less zero-sum and have general elections matter more. As long as elections are being decided, as they will be today in Texas's primary, where as long as the parties are effectively colluding to create fewer and fewer competitive districts, that moves power to the extremes in this particular environment. So we need to think aggressively and holistically about how we can have more genuinely competitive elections, which will empower and incentivize members of Congress, many of whom who know better, to reach out and try to win over the reasonable edge of the opposition instead of solely playing to the base. We need to have more representative outcomes so politics feels less zero sum, which itself creates sort of a psychological precondition for civil war. And I think we need to lean into those prescriptions. Defending democracy needs the broadest possible coalition, knowing that we are representing direct continuity with our best traditions as a country, and that we've been through far worse before, and we'll get through this before. And it does take empathy and kindness and firmness to reach out. And it's difficult stuff, but it was rare in Lincoln's time as well. But we cannot ignore the policy structures that will change the rules, you change the game, and that will change the posture within which we reach out to people.
Thank you, John. I would love to talk to you for another hour. We've got a lot of further questions to get to, but we just hit 12:01 in my time, 2:01 in your time, and it is time to end. So I hope people buy the book. I hope they really think about it, and I hope they think about this prescription for the current situation, as well as they're reading about a past leader doing a great job on a past very difficult situation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you guys for everything you do at Carnegie.
Take care.